Good morning and welcome to Sunday School. My name is Brandon Keaton and I'm the Director of Music Ministries here at First Methodist of Albany. And today we're going to be continuing in our study of the reflection of God and what the image of God is like, and those spots in Scripture that show just a little bit more of what God is like and when he appears to us. And this story that we're going to look at today is from Luke chapter 9. And it's a story that you are very familiar with, I have no doubt. The Transfiguration of Jesus. It's a great story. You know, in all of the Gospels, it follows right on the heels of one of the most significant points in the lives of the disciples after Jesus has called them and they have been sent out. I think Luke talks about sending out the 12 and sending out 70, or sometimes it says 72, and they talk about all the things that they were able to do because of the authority that Jesus had given them. And so, but after this, Jesus, like in the first part of Luke chapter 9, Jesus sends out the 12, and then he feeds the 5,000, and then he takes them to a place away, and he shares with them that he is going to be going to Jerusalem, and that he is going to suffer there. And this is the first time that he predicts his death, but that comes at a time whenever the disciples find out, or when Jesus says to the disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And of course, they talk about who the crowds think he is, but then he asks them point blank, well, what about you? What do you think? And of course, Peter is the one who answers that you are the Christ, the Son of God. And so then he predicts his death, and then after a little bit of time, he goes with three of his disciples, his three favorites, I guess. And I guess Jesus had favorites, Peter, James, and John, and he takes them up into a mountain, and there he is transfigured before them. Well, so Luke basically dates this transfiguration to 8 days after Peter's confession and Jesus' first prediction of his suffering and death. So we know that in this story of the Transfiguration, God's voice breaks through into the human realm. When this, and this is something that has happened once before in the Gospels. In Luke chapter 3, we get the story of Jesus and his baptism, and we know what does the Spirit, or what does God the Father say when the Spirit lands on Jesus? He says, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." And we're going to get another one of those voices from heaven that are going to not only spur Jesus on, but also to help the faith of those disciples who were with him. And so the Transfiguration comes at a time of crisis in the life of Jesus. Peter has his confession that Jesus is the Messiah, and that signals the end of his ministry to the multitudes in Galilee. But then, he has been widely received in Galilee as a miracle worker, as someone who can heal, someone who can deliver from demonic oppression, but he's not always thought of as a savior. And so he is soon to begin his journey to Jerusalem. And in the Gospel of Luke, everything from about this point on, Jesus sets his face toward Jerusalem, and he's going to go there, and he has no qualms about what's going to happen there. He knows that it's the Father's will, And so he is determined. But right before that, he does take these 3 closest disciples to the mountain. And some people think, well, traditionally, this mountain was Mount Tabor, which is kind of in the middle of Lower Galilee. Kind of just stands all to itself, this little rounded off mountain. I say little, I mean it's not like it's not a hill, that's for sure, but and that traditionally has been the place. But some people believe that since Jesus was in Caesarea Philippi, whenever he asked the disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" That he may have just gone a little further north to Mount Hermon, which is the highest peak in what is now the state of Israel, and it's right on the border with Syria. And it's one of those places, one of those few places where there's actually snow a good bit of the year. So you can do a little skiing on Mount Hermon if you go there today. But so Jesus is finding a place of solitude with his disciples. He goes up to pray. And it's not really hard to imagine what kind of things Jesus would have been praying about. Of course, this has to be about what's ahead, what's coming up in Jerusalem. And we know that the Father does answer Jesus' prayer, but that answer is not the removal of the cross. Rather, God reveals the glory of his kingdom in its completion, in its consummation. The divine glory on the mountain teaches the disciples that true glory and the cross go together. That seems like a paradox, and it really is. The Transfiguration is designed to encourage Jesus as he makes his way to Jerusalem and to the cross. It is a reminder that everything is in God's plan and that he's going to fulfill that, and that in being lifted up on the cross, he will draw all people to him. John, the Gospel of John, talks very regularly about being lifted up, but in John, lifted up not only means lifted up on the cross, but it also means exalted in glory. Those two things, those paradoxical things, go together. Okay, well, let's go ahead and read the passage. It says, about 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John, and James with him and went up onto a mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. 2 men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor, talking with Jesus. They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. Peter and his companions were very sleepy, but when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men standing with him. As the men were leaving Jesus, Peter said to him, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what he was saying. While he was speaking, a cloud appeared and covered them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. A voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, they found that Jesus was alone. The disciples kept this to themselves and did not tell anyone at that time what they had seen. Well, of course, we've talked a little bit about this, but the Transfiguration occurs while Jesus is praying. His whole appearance changes. He becomes whiter than white, or his clothes become whiter than white. In Mark, it talks about that it's so white that no person who is basically a professional bleacher could get it so white. I mean, it's like a flash of lightning. So God's majesty shines forth through the face of Jesus and through his whole body. And so, and Peter later, when he's remembering this in 2 Peter chapter 1, he says, "We were eyewitnesses of his majesty, for we received honor and glory from God the Father when the voice came to him from the majestic glory saying, 'This is my son whom I love. With him I am well pleased.'" And John, of course, he says, "We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father." So we're seeing that Jesus is showing just a little bit of his heavenly glory to the disciples. And so then on the mountain, Moses and Elijah appear with Jesus. These two men are, they shine just as bright as Jesus does, and they talk about his departure. Well, of course, his departure is what's going to happen in Jerusalem, with him going to the cross and dying and rising again and then ascending back to the right hand of the Father. Well, that word, that noun, departure, is exodos in the Greek, which of course is Exodus. And so it's the same word that the Greek Old Testament translations used to allude to Moses and Israel's going out of Egypt, free from the bondage of Pharaoh. So here, the departure, the Exodus, is about his death. It also probably refers to the whole package, the death, resurrection, and ascension, since they're both means by which Jesus departs the earth. And the verb to bring to fulfillment speaks about the fulfillment of God's plan of salvation. So Jesus will reenact the Exodus, but this time he won't be leading them out of physical bondage, just one people, the people of Israel. He'll be leading all people out of their spiritual bondage. It's important that Jesus is seen with Moses and Elijah, because both of these are like the Old Testament in a nutshell. So we have Moses, who was the great lawgiver, and we have Elijah, who was the great prophet. And so they are representatives of the law and the prophets. And so, of course, Jesus has talked about how that the law and the prophets testify about him and about his coming and about what would happen with him. So then those representatives are there to lend their approval to him. So Moses and Elijah point to the fulfillment of all the Old Testament shadows and prophecies about the Messiah. Their appearance is intended to assure the disciples what will happen in Jerusalem agrees with Old Testament prophecy. So it's not just something that's made up or something that's a decision that was made on the fly. This is something that has been the plan all along. It's interesting, too, that they never really grasp the significance of why they're there and why these two men are there. Later as they approach Jerusalem, they're still struggling with the fact that Jesus has predicted that he would die. Of course they think he's going to live. The Messiah lives. The Messiah is a conquering king. It's just he wasn't conquering a physical kingdom at this point. So moving on, of course, the three disciples were very sleepy. And so maybe it was night, maybe they were just tired, but eventually they're awakened. When you think about it, the Gospels oftentimes show the disciples being a little bit sleepy whenever something important in the life of Jesus is going on. It's here, it's in the Garden of Gethsemane. They're tired and they don't know what to do. Anyway, so it's another one of those kinds of times in their lives. Well, so I guess maybe the light or the conversation or whatever wakes them up. And, once they're basically awake and they see Jesus' glory and the two heavenly visitors there with him, Peter realizes, hey, this is a great moment, and this is a moment that we should probably try to commemorate or try to stick to, But then he notices that Moses and Elijah are leaving, and so he says maybe we should build 3 tabernacles or 3 shelters or tents for Jesus and for Moses and for Elijah. Basically what he's getting at is he's saying it's good for us to be here, and it's so wonderful that maybe we ought to try to stay here as long as possible. But Peter does not know what he's saying. I think that's a funny thing. It's in parentheses, a parenthetical comment that Luke makes about this. Peter didn't know what he was talking about, didn't know what he was saying, which I think is kind of funny. and goes with his character. Oftentimes Peter speaks before he really thinks. So he doesn't understand the situation, and so it's an experience like this can only last for a little while. Jesus still has to finish the mission that he has in Jerusalem. And so, he can't atone for the sins of the world while he's standing up on a mountaintop with Moses and Elijah. He's got to come down and face all of those things that are going to happen to him in Jerusalem. So, but before Jesus can even respond to Peter, then there's a cloud that covers the mountain and covers the disciples and Jesus. Of course, we know that the cloud is a sign of God's presence. That was something that was a part of the tabernacle tradition, that whenever the children of Israel were supposed to move out and camp somewhere else, the cloud would lift off of the tabernacle, and when the cloud descended, they knew that was the place where God wanted them to camp for the time. That's where his presence would be. Well, so here then the cloud represents the presence of God, and so the disciples then are scared to death because they're going into this cloud. Maybe they were just scared because it was a cloud, or maybe they recognized the symmetry there, the symbolism of that cloud being, that the presence of God was there. And if you remember back in Exodus, whenever the presence of God came near the people of Israel, they got scared. It was not something that they felt comfortable with. And maybe that's true for us. Maybe we shouldn't always feel. Maybe we have made that too relaxed. Maybe we have gotten to a point where we think it's no big deal for the presence of God to be with us. But it is always a big deal. It is always something that is far beyond what we could ever think about, even what we could ever ask for. And so maybe it's time for us to really consider how do we enter into the presence of God? What does that feel like? Should that be a regular occurrence? And of course, I think it should, but it should always be one that comes with reverence, and knowing that God's presence is vital not only to our lives, but to all of our work in this world, that we need to be with him, but that it also comes with a little trepidation, knowing that he is the God of the universe who deems us worthy to come into his presence, of course through what Christ did on the cross. Well, that cloud then, of course, is accompanied by a voice. And like I said earlier, we have heard this voice before at the baptism of Jesus, and he says something very similar to what he said at the baptism. And he says, "This is my beloved Son. This is my Son, thy chosen one, the beloved one, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." And so, what is God saying about this? The short answer of it is listen to him. I've chosen him. He's my Son. Listen to him. He has my word. He is my agent. He has all my authority. But on another level, he's telling the disciples, and he's telling us, that the law and the prophets got them so far, but Jesus goes all the way. Jesus takes us all the way into the presence of God. That he breaks down all the barriers that the law and the prophets would have put in place, and he tears those down, so that way we are able to approach the presence of the Lord because of what Christ did. So when the voice from the cloud stops speaking, Moses and Elijah are gone, and only Jesus and the three disciples are there, and he no longer looks heavenly anymore. And Luke tells us that the that the experience has been so overwhelming that Peter, James, and John don't talk about it. They don't talk about it for months. They don't tell anybody what they've seen. And that it's only after Jesus' resurrection that they come to understand his majesty and his glory, and that he will be declared with power to be the Son of God by his resurrection from the dead, as Paul says in Romans 1:4. His triumph over death makes the mysterious significance of the transfiguration more apparent. Well, what does this mean for us? It's a great story. It shows Jesus in his majesty and glory, and demonstrates to the disciples that he really is, that he has the seal of approval of God on him, and that he is going to complete the work that God has called him to. Well, here are some things that are practical for us. There are 5 practical things that are relevant, what the Transfiguration has. I'm going to say that again. The Transfiguration has deep practical relevances to Christians. And here's the first one. As Jesus prays, he is transfigured. Well, that's true for us. Worship and communion with God produce a transformation of our lives. It touches on our whole life, the inner and the outer person. We become, our habits, our activities, everything we do becomes transformed by being in the presence of God. By praying, we are transfigured. Number 2, the subject of Jesus' conversation with Moses and Elijah is his departure. His coming exodus has far greater spiritual consequences than the deliverance of Israel from Egypt. Moses led his people out of physical bondage, but through Jesus' exodus, of course, his death and his resurrection, he leads his people out of their spiritual bondage. He then makes us truly free. He who the Son has set free is free indeed. Number 3, the Transfiguration provides an example of the kinds of people who will inhabit the kingdom to come. Moses and Elijah are those kinds of people. The 2 heavenly visitors represent 2 types of believers, the ones who are resurrected from the dead and the ones who meet Christ upon his return without experiencing death. So remember, Moses died, but Elijah was carried to heaven in a chariot of fire. And we might also take a look at Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, the first letter, chapter 4, 13 through 18, that talks about those who have died in Christ, and then those who are alive at the time that he comes back. Number 4, the Transfiguration points to the nature of the resurrected body. Jesus, Moses, Elijah, they are their bodily features are changed. And Jesus's people can expect to undergo a change just like Jesus. Paul expressed it when Christ returns, he will transform our lowly bodies so that they will be like his glorious body. He says this in Philippians 3:21. So there will be a difference. And in 1 Corinthians, I believe it's 15, Paul talks about the differences between the physical body and the body that is glorified, the resurrected body. And so we know that we can expect that. I am hopeful that the resurrected body will be thinner than what I am today. We can hope. They say that you'll be recognizable, but I could stand to be a little less recognizable, honestly. And then number 5, finally, the Transfiguration reminds us of a mountaintop experience. Peter is caught up in what happens. He doesn't know what he's talking about, but all he knows is, wow, this is great, and I wish I could stay here forever. And I don't know about you, but I've had experiences with the Lord in a time of worship, sometimes public, sometimes private, sometimes in prayer, sometimes whatever, that I just knew that the presence of the Lord was there and that it was powerful and strong and was speaking to me. And I just wanted to stay there forever. Sometimes that's happened at different stages of my life, and how wonderful it has been to experience those. And I hope and pray that you have experienced something like that as well. But the problem with that is, of course, that when we don't leave the mountaintop, we do not fulfill our calling that Christ has given us to go into all the world, to make disciples, to teach them, to be salt and light, you name it. We're not fulfilling that because what we're doing is we're filling up on that glory and that worship and that wonder that comes with being in the presence of God. And all of that is great, and all of it is necessary. But why is it necessary? It's necessary so that we can fulfill our calling, that we can be fully who we're intended to be when we have experienced that, and then go out in that power, in that glory, in that authority that Christ has given us. And so, though the inspiration, the wonder, and the worship are tremendous, no one can live forever on the mountain of glory. There are peaks and valleys for all of us, and we may live from the high of each peak, but we also have to remember that when we are in the valleys, the presence of the Lord is still there with us, guiding us, strengthening us, leading us into the life that He wants us to have, and more importantly, I think, the life He wants us to share with others. Let that be our prayer today, that we would take what we get on the mountaintop of transfiguration, of transformation, and share it with each other. Thanks be to God for His indescribable gift. Amen.